Story 2. Attila, death on his wedding night. Some deaths are glorious. Some are forgotten. And then there's Attila, the Scourge of God, the man who terrified Rome, the conqueror who shook all of Europe. He didn't die in battle, not by the sword, not by poison. Attila died on his wedding night. A powerful king, a young bride, a feast that lasted till dawn, and then silence. What happened? Was it an accident, a hidden plot, or fate itself? In this story, we'll uncover not just his mysterious death, but also the man, the empire he built, and the strange legacy he left behind. So get comfortable, lean in, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the past is darker, stranger, and closer than you think. Now, let's begin. Part 1. Attila, the man who terrified Europe. Picture this. Europe. The year is around 440 AD. The Roman Empire, once mighty, unshakable, was breaking apart. Its borders stretched thin, its emperors weak, its armies exhausted. Across the Rhine and Danube, tribes were moving. Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, one by one, pushing, raiding, settling on Roman soil. But beyond them, from the endless steppes of Central Asia, came something even darker, even stranger, even more terrifying. The Huns. They didn't build cities, they didn't farm fields, they lived on horseback. They hunted, raided, moved with the wind. To settled Romans, they looked less like men and more like a storm. Unpredictable, unstoppable, merciless. And at the heart of this storm was one man, Attila. The Romans called him the Scourge of God. Not a king, not just a warrior, but a punishment, a living curse on the empire. So, who was he? Why did his shadow make the world tremble? And how did his legend grow so vast that even today, his name means fear? Let's begin. The world of the Huns. The Huns came from the steppes. Vast oceans of grass, flat, endless, and brutal. Life there was hard. Only the strongest survived. And the strongest were those who could ride. Huns learned to ride almost before they could walk. Their horses were small but powerful. Their bows, composite, deadly accurate. From horseback, they could release arrows at full speed and change direction mid-shot. Roman soldiers, trained to fight in disciplined lines, had never seen anything like it. They would march out, shields locked, ready for a slow clash. Then suddenly, arrows rained down from riders who never stood still. Before Rome could strike back, the Huns vanished, only to appear again behind them. It was chaos, and the Huns thrived in chaos. Their appearance added to the fear. Romans described them as short, broad-shouldered, with scarred faces. Their cheeks sometimes cut in childhood, leaving deep marks. Their eyes narrow and sharp. Their hair coarse and braided. To the settled peoples of Europe, they looked alien. And the Huns used that fear. When a Hun warband approached, villages emptied. Farms burned. Survivors whispered of demons on horseback. This was the world Attila inherited. And he would make it his empire. The rise of Attila was born at the turn of the 5th century. We don't know exactly where, but by the 430s, he emerged as a leader alongside his brother Bleda. At first, the brothers worked together. They struck deals with the Romans. Tribute flowed in, gold, livestock, even silk. Rome thought it was buying peace, but peace was never enough for Attila. By 445, Bleda was gone. Some say Attila murdered him. Others claim he died in a hunting accident. Whatever the truth, Attila became sole ruler. And his legend truly began. Attila the leader. Attila was not physically impressive, not tall, not handsome. But presence? He had it. Roman envoys who met him wrote of his charisma. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. At feasts, while his chiefs drank from golden goblets, Attila used a wooden cup. While others wore jewels, he dressed simply. It wasn't humility. It was power. A statement. I am greater than wealth itself. One Roman diplomat, Priscus, described meeting him. He wrote, "This was no ordinary man. He seemed born to shake the nations. He ruled not by riches, but by fear and by presence." Attila demanded loyalty. Tribes who resisted were crushed. Tribes who followed him were rewarded with land, plunder, and protection. Through fear, through promise, through charisma, he united the fractious Huns and many neighboring peoples. By the late 440s, his empire stretched from the Black Sea to the Hungarian plain. Dozens of tribes, Germanic, Slavic, Turkic, answered to him. This was no longer just a nomadic horde. It was a superpower. Rome trembles. Rome knew it, and Rome feared it. By the 5th century, Rome was not the empire of Caesar. The Western Empire in Italy was weak. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople was rich, but vulnerable. Both paid Attila tribute. Every year, carts of gold rolled into his camps. Rome bought survival with money. But Attila didn't just take gold, he took pride. He made emperors kneel. He turned the greatest empire the world had ever known into his debtor. To the Romans, every payment was humiliation. To Attila, every coin was proof of his power. The Scourge of God. Christian writers soon gave him a name. The Scourge of God. They said he was sent by heaven as punishment for Roman sins. Not a man, but a whip. A divine scourge striking the empire. And it fit. Everywhere he went, destruction followed. Cities burned, armies shattered. Even emperors bowed. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, he was a savior. The one who made Rome pay. The one who humbled the mighty. The charisma of fear. But here's what's fascinating. Attila wasn't only feared, he was admired. Many who met him, Romans, even enemies, came away impressed. He was ruthless, yes, but he was also magnetic. Captured tribes sometimes chose to serve him. Germanic warriors swore loyalty, not because they had to, but because they wanted to follow him. Why? Because he offered something Rome could not. A vision, a place in a greater whole, a seat at the table of the most feared man in the world. The shadow over Europe. By the mid-5th century, Attila's shadow stretched over all of Europe. From Gaul to the Balkans, from the Danube to the Alps. He raided, he negotiated, he conquered. Every treaty made him richer. Every raid made him stronger. To peasants, he was doom on horseback. To emperors, he was a reminder of weakness. To history, he became a symbol of ambition, terror, and unstoppable power. And yet, Attila was still human. He laughed rarely. He drank sparingly. He demanded loyalty. But he also dreamed of more, always more. It was that hunger for land, for power, for glory that drove him deeper into Europe. And it would make him the most feared man alive. But it would also set the stage for his fall. Because for all his might, his story would not end in battle. Not on the field, sword in hand, but on a night of celebration. A wedding night. A night that turned into mystery and death. But that is for later. For now, remember this. Attila was not just a barbarian warlord. He was a force, a storm given human shape. The man who made all of Europe tremble. Part 2. The Road to Gaul. Attila's Western Campaign. 1. Rome trembles again. The year was 451. Attila, master of the Huns, turned his gaze west. Rome was already a shadow of its former self. Corruption, factional politics, a military spread too thin. But Gaul, the land we now call France, was still wealthy. Its cities still glittered, its lands still fertile. To Attila, Gaul was a prize, a jewel waiting to be seized. And once again, Rome trembled. 2. The March of the Huns. Picture it. A vast wave of horsemen sweeping across Europe. Tens of thousands of riders, swift, ruthless, armed with the composite bow, the secret weapon of the steppe. They crossed the Rhine. They burned towns. They plundered villages. The Roman chroniclers describe it in horror. Cities set aflame, people fleeing in terror, the Huns moving like a storm cloud. For Attila, it wasn't just conquest. It was terror as strategy. Every fire sent a message: submit or be destroyed. 3. The allies of Rome. But Rome wasn't entirely helpless. General Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman commander, understood the threat. He knew Rome alone couldn't stop Attila, so he forged alliances: the Visigoths, the Franks, the Burgundians, former enemies. Now, desperate allies. The key was the Visigothic king, Theodoric I, a warrior in his own right. Together, Rome and the Goths formed a coalition army. Aetius knew this was Rome's last chance. If Gaul fell, Rome itself would be next. 4. The Siege of Orléans. One of the most dramatic moments came at Orléans. Attila laid siege to the city. His horsemen surrounded the walls. The citizens prayed for deliverance. Inside, supplies dwindled. Panic spread. It seemed inevitable. The Huns would break through. But then, Aetius Erfaun, the Roman-led coalition, appeared on the horizon. Attila, realizing he might be trapped, pulled back. It was a narrow escape. But the stage was set. The armies of Rome and Attila would meet head-to-head. 5. The Catalonian Plains. The decisive battle came in June 451. The Catalonian Plains, modern-day northeastern France. Two massive armies faced each other. Attila's Huns, fierce and mobile. Aetius and Theodoric's coalition, stubborn and determined. The battle was brutal. Cavalry charges, hand-to-hand combat, arrows darkening the sky. Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, was killed in the fighting. But his people fought harder, enraged by his death. Attila himself, so the sources say, watched from a wooden throne, overseeing the battle like a god of war. By nightfall, neither side had total victory, but Attila had been stopped. For the first time. 6. Why Attila was halted. Historians still debate the outcome. Some call it a Roman victory. Others, simply a stalemate. But the truth is clear. Attila's aura of invincibility was broken. The coalition showed that the Huns could be resisted if Europe stood together. It wasn't strategy alone. It was unity born of desperation. For Attila, the campaign was costly. He retreated. Gaul remained out of his grasp. 7. Attila's revenge. But the story doesn't end there. The following year, 452, Attila struck again. This time, Italy. He ravaged the north. Aquileia, one of the great Roman cities, was destroyed. So thoroughly that it never truly recovered. The road to Rome lay open. The eternal city, undefended. The world held its breath. Would Attila sack Rome itself? 8. The meeting with Leo. And then, history took a dramatic turn. On the road to Rome, Attila met Pope Leo I. The exact details are shrouded in legend, but the image endures: the mighty warlord and the holy man. Some say Leo persuaded Attila with words of peace. Others say Attila saw a vision, Saints Peter and Paul warning him away. Practical historians suggest plague and famine weakened the Huns. Rome wasn't worth the risk. Whatever the truth, Attila turned back. Rome was spared. 9. Analysis: why did he fail? So why did Attila's Western campaign falter? 3 reasons. Logistics: his army could devastate but not sustain. Resistance: for once, Rome and its allies stood firm. Overstretch: the empire of the Huns was vast but fragile. Attila was a master of terror, but terror alone couldn't hold Gaul. He had met his limit. 10. The shadow of fear remains. And yet, Despite retreat, despite setbacks, Attila remained a name of dread. To Romans, he was still the Scourge of God. To Christians, his retreat was proof of divine mercy. To his warriors, it was simply a pause before the next strike. Because Attila wasn't done. Not yet. And the next chapter of his story would be even stranger, even darker. Part 3. The Mad Priest on the Throne, Rome. The Eternal City. By the mid-5th century, it was no longer the empire of Caesars, no longer the invincible power of Augustus or Trajan. Instead, a shadow of itself, weakened, divided, and terrified of one man. Attila, the Scourge of God. And now, after the bloody clash in Gaul, he turned his eyes to Italy, to Rome itself. But this chapter isn't just about battles, it's about faith, about fear, and about one of the most dramatic confrontations in ancient history, when a priest armed only with words faced down the most feared warlord alive. The March into Italy. In the year 452, Attila crossed the Alps. His army swept into northern Italy like a storm. Aquileia, one of Rome's strongest cities, resisted. But Attila would not be denied. His forces besieged it. Days turned to weeks. The defenders held firm. Until, legend says, Attila saw a stork flying away from the city walls, carrying its young. He took it as a sign. The gods have abandoned this city, he declared. The next day, his men broke through. Aquileia was destroyed. So completely that chroniclers said later travelers could barely find its ruins. From there, Attila's army ravaged the Po Valley. Milan, Verona, cities burned, villages fled, famine and plague spread in his wake. Rome trembles. And what of Rome? The Senate was powerless. The Emperor, Valentinian III, weak and indecisive. All eyes turned instead to one man, Leo, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. He wasn't a general. He commanded no armies, but he had authority, moral authority, spiritual authority, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to use it. The meeting picture the scene. Attila seated on horseback, surrounded by Hun chieftains, his warriors armored, fierce, their bows and spears gleaming in the sun, and approaching him, an old man in priestly robes, Pope Leo I come, unarmed, carrying nothing but his staff and his faith. The air must have been electric, two worlds colliding, the pagan warlord who called himself favored of the gods, and the Christian priest who claimed authority from the God of heaven. What was said that day? No one knows for certain. Some say Leo promised Attila tribute. Others say he warned him that attacking Rome would bring divine wrath. Later legend even claims Attila saw a vision, St. Peter and St. Paul armed with swords standing beside Leo. Whatever the truth, Attila listened. And then, astonishingly, he turned back. Why did Attila retreat? This question has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would the fearsome Attila, undefeated in so many battles, retreat before an old priest? Several reasons. First, practicality. His army was exhausted. Supplies were running low. Disease was spreading. Second, politics. In the east, the Eastern Roman Empire was stirring again. Marcian, the emperor in Constantinople, threatened to attack Attila's homeland if he didn't withdraw. Third, psychology. Attila was ruthless, but he was also superstitious. He read omens. He feared curses. And perhaps, just perhaps, Leo's words struck a chord of fear even in him, the mad priest on the throne. Why do we call this part the mad priest on the throne? Because for the first time, it wasn't Rome's emperor who saved the city. It wasn't generals. It wasn't armies. It was a priest, a Christian bishop who stood in the emperor's place. And in that moment, the spiritual authority of the papacy began to eclipse the political authority of Rome itself. This was the seed of medieval Europe, a world where popes would stand above kings, where priests could defy emperors, where the church, not the state, would claim the throne of power. And it all began here, on that day when Leo faced Attila. Attila's image. For Christians, Attila became more than just a man. He was a symbol, the scourge sent by God to punish sin, the barbarian who could only be stopped by faith. Writers called him the whip of heaven. Artists later painted him as a monster. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, placed him in hell among the violent. But in truth, Attila was no madman. He was shrewd, calculated, a ruler who balanced terror with diplomacy. Still, the legend stuck, and the meeting with Leo became one of the defining moments of late antiquity. The retreat, after turning back from Rome, Attila withdrew north. But he was not finished. He planned another campaign. This time, not against Italy, but against Constantinople, against the East. Yet fate had other plans. Within a year, Attila would be dead. On the night of his wedding, a death as mysterious as his life. But that is for the next chapter. Reflection. Pause for a moment. Think about the symbolism. Rome, once mistress of the world, reduced to relying on a priest to save it. The empire crumbling, the church rising. Attila, the terror of nations, halted not by swords, but by words. This was the turning point, the hinge of history. From here on, the medieval world began to take shape. So, what do we make of it? Attila had brought Rome to its knees. But he never conquered it. Instead, he left behind something stranger. A story where power shifted from emperors to priests, from armies to faith. And that story would echo for 1,000 years. Part 4. The Fall. The death of Attila and the collapse of the Hunnic Empire. 1. A night of triumph. And doom Attila, the man who brought Rome to its knees. By 453, he was at the height of his power. The Romans paid him tribute. Kings sent him daughters, gold, and promises. His empire stretched across the plains of Central Europe, Hungary, the Balkans, the steppes. That spring, a new marriage was arranged. Her name? Ildiko, a young Germanic bride. Historians still argue, was it love, alliance, or simply conquest? For Attila, it was triumph. Another wife, another symbol of dominance. The wedding feast was grand, music, fire, overflowing cups of mead. The Huns drank, the warlords laughed, the Scourge of God basked in glory. And then, silence. The next morning, Attila was dead. Pause. Not on the battlefield, not by an assassin's blade, but alone. In his bed. 2. The mystery of his death. How did the most feared man in Europe die so suddenly? The ancient sources disagree. Priscus, the Roman historian, claims, Attila drank too much, went to bed, and choked on his own blood. A nosebleed that drowned him in the night. Jordanes, another chronicler, repeats the tale, but others whisper darker theories. Some say Ildiko, the new bride, killed him. A dagger in the night. A secret revenge for her people. Others hint at Roman plots. After all, who benefited most from his death? Rome had been spared, just barely. And now, suddenly, Attila was gone. And then there is fate. The belief, especially among Christians of the time, that God himself struck Attila down. The Scourge of God had finished his purpose. His death was divine judgment. The truth? We may never know, but the mystery made Attila's death even larger than life. 3. The funeral of a conqueror. The Huns did not bury their king like ordinary men. According to legend, Attila's funeral was a spectacle of fire, steel, and tears. His warriors cut their faces with swords, so that the greatest of men would be honored not with women's weeping, but with warriors' blood. They placed him in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, one of iron. Gold, for the tribute he had taken. Silver, for the loyalty of his allies, iron for the strength of his arms, and then the grave. Some say the Huns buried him in secret under a river, diverting the waters and then letting them flow back to hide his tomb. The slaves who built it? They were slaughtered, so no one could ever reveal its place. To this day, Attila's grave has never been found. It lies somewhere in the mists of Europe. A ghost, like the man himself. 4. The collapse of an empire. With Attila's death, the empire trembled. The Huns had been united by one man's will. Now, there was no Attila, only his sons, fighting each other. Elak, Dengisic, Ernak, each wanted the throne. But none had Attila's charisma. None had his iron fist. The subject tribes, Goths, Gepids, Rugi, had bowed to Attila out of fear. With him gone, they smelled weakness. The first great revolt came at the Battle of Nedao, 454. The Goths, led by Ardaric, rebelled. They crushed the Huns. Elak, Attila's eldest, was killed. The empire shattered. The subject peoples broke free. In just 1 year after Attila's death, the empire he built dissolved into dust. 5. Why did it fall so fast? The Hunnic Empire was unlike Rome. It had no marble cities, no bureaucracy, no laws carved in stone. It was built on fear, on tribute, on one man's power. When that man vanished, the glue that held it together melted away. The Huns had been a storm, but storms pass quickly. Some historians argue the empire was never stable to begin with. It was a predator state, feeding off its neighbors. Once the prey fought back, the predator collapsed. Others suggest it was inevitable. Attila's death was simply the spark. The fire was already burning. 6. The legend outlives the man yet. Even as his empire fell, Attila's legend grew. To the Romans, he remained the Scourge of God. To the Germans, he entered their epic tales. The Nibelungenlied, where Attila becomes Etzel, a mighty king. To Hungarians, he was remembered as a founding figure, a symbol of ancestral strength. And across Europe, mothers still whispered his name to frighten children. Behave, or Attila will come. The man died. The empire crumbled. But the shadow endured. Chapter 7. Closing Reflections. Attila's fall is a reminder. Power built on fear is fragile. An empire without roots cannot outlast a storm. And sometimes, the greatest conquerors die not in battle, but in silence. A wedding bed, a final breath. And history changed forever. Attila was gone. But his ghost lingered, long after his empire turned to dust. Part 5. Aftermath and Legacy. Attila is dead, but his echo never vanished. A mysterious death. An empire crumbling to dust. And then, only fragments remained. Fragments of memory. Fragments of myth. And sometimes, it's those fragments that outlive entire kingdoms. The Hunnic Empire. Collapse at dawn. Attila's death was like a flame snuffed out. The vast empire he built, unraveled in just a few years. His sons fought for power. Elak, Dengisic, Ernach. 3 brothers who could never share one throne. In 454, at the Battle of Nedao, the tide turned. The Goths, the Gepids, the Rugians, all the tribes once under Hun rule rose up. They crushed the Hunnic army. The fire that once burned across Europe was reduced to ashes. But here's the twist. The fear Attila had planted survived. Why did Attila make Rome tremble? This question still haunts the 5th century. Why did one nomadic warlord shake the eternal city? First, speed, and surprise. Hun cavalry moved faster than any army Europe had ever seen. 100 miles in a single day. Here one moment, gone the next. Second, image and psychology. The Huns mastered fear. Stories of Attila, never defeated, drinking the blood of enemies, spread like wildfire. Cities froze in terror, long before the first arrow flew. Third, politics. Attila knew the chessboard. He forced Rome to pay tribute in gold. He split Germanic tribes apart. And he used a marriage proposal from Honoria as the perfect excuse for invasion. Violence, image, politics, combined. They turned Attila into a nightmare. Attila through enemy eyes. Romans wrote about him with obsession. They called him flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. To them, Attila wasn't just a man. He was an instrument of divine punishment. Think about that. When your enemy doesn't see you as human, but as the hand of God's wrath. That's a power stronger than any sword. Attila in legend. After his death, Attila didn't fade. He transformed. In Germany's Nibelungenlied, he became Etzel, woven into the tragic saga of Siegfried and Kriemhild. In Scandinavia, he reappeared as Atli, cruel, majestic, unforgettable. In France, in Italy, in Hungary, his name lived on. Each culture bent him into its own myth. That's the clue. Attila wasn't just history. He was collective memory. A ghost Europe needed to explain its age of chaos. Attila and the shift of power. Here's the real legacy. Even though the Huns vanished, Attila changed Europe's balance forever. Before Attila, Rome still believed it was the center. After Attila, Rome knew the truth. Germanic tribes would decide Europe's fate. And they did. 2 decades after Attila's death, Rome fell. The Goths built kingdoms in Italy and Spain. The Franks rose in Gaul. The Vandals seized North Africa. The so-called barbarians became rulers. And in the collective mind, Attila was the one who opened that door. Fear that outlived the Huns. Here's the strange part. Even after the Huns were gone, people still feared their return. In the 9th century, the Magyars swept into Europe. People believed they were Attila's descendants, and fear came roaring back. Centuries later, Hungarian kings claimed direct descent from Attila as proof of their right to rule. That's how long his shadow stretched. A double-edged figure. Let's pause and flip the coin. To Romans, he was the devil. To the Huns, he was the greatest king. The historian Jordanes once wrote, Attila was born into the world's destruction. 2 faces, a destroyer to some, a savior to others. That's why Attila fascinates us. That's why he refuses to die in our imagination. Layers of legacy. We can peel Attila's legacy into 3 layers. 1, political and military. Attila proved nomadic confederations could threaten even the oldest empires. He was Europe's wake-up call. Never underestimate the step. 2, cultural and psychological. He became fear incarnate, a weapon of myth, alive long after his armies were gone. Even today, the word Hun still carries echoes of brutality. 3, mythic. Attila walked out of history into legend. Few leaders ever crossed that line, but he did. Claimed by enemies and heirs alike. Attila is dead, his empire, dust, but his name still burns. Like a streak of fire on the horizon. Rome once trembled at him. Tribes once cursed him. But history never buried him. Because some deaths aren't endings. They're the beginnings of legend. And when we look back at the 5th century, an age of collapse, of migrations, of new kingdoms, we see Attila not just as a man, but as a chapter, a milestone, a symbol. And that chapter is only the beginning.